Psychologists of Reddit. Have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Story 1. Obligatory not a psychologist, but I used to work as an aide in a special education classroom in the middle school. Now, the year I started, a majority of my workload was 8th grade boys, and 2 of them had deeply troubling behavioral issues. One kid assaulted a girl in his class. At school, in front is a bunch of other kids. He actually got arrested for it, but the school couldn't expel him because of his disability. For the rest of the year, he was forbidden from being anywhere, including the lunchroom, with her. I spent a lot of time essentially babysitting this kid, and because he didn't give a crap about the school, he did practically nothing during his time in the resource room. The last I heard, he'd been arrested again for breaking into someone's house and stealing a handgun. But the one who scared me was completely antisocial, to the point of threatening to hurt himself or others when a field trip or school assembly was coming up. We eventually had to tell his parents in advance so they wouldn't bring him to school. He talked about death constantly, all while extremely medicated, so it was a very muted, mumbled, and done through 1,000-yard stare with spittle coming from his mouth. One of the teachers was pregnant. She wasn't his teacher, but he knew who she was. And one day he asked me, would Mrs. X's baby live if someone ran her over in a car? I told him I didn't know and tried to change the subject. Then he asked, what if someone cut her stomach open? What if they stabbed her? What if she had been dead for a while and no one found her? Now, this part really freaked me out and I had to report it to the sped teacher. When I told her, she said he had asked her and other students the same thing and scared the crap out of them. She said the pregnant teacher had been advised to avoid him in case he did or said anything to upset her. Story 2. A very sweet, mostly blind teenager who was going through his first psychotic breakdown and had a love of martial arts, taekwondo if I remember correctly, was really good at it. He couldn't see and would practice kicks and at one point accidentally kicked one of the reinforced shatterproof windows in the quiet room. Think padded room without the padding. Turns out they were shatter-resistant. He just destroyed it with that kick. Why those particular details? Because he would practice his kicks everywhere. Was mostly blind. And the one time he flipped up to practice one and I was walking around the corner, it came literal centimeters from my face and I felt the impact of it against the air like a physical force bashing into my face. Sweetest kid in the world, and he would have been mortified if it had connected because things would have broken. A lot of things. He also grabbed my arm once in a sudden firm grasp and asked if I wanted to do taekwondo with him. No, I did not. Story 3. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long, violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act, like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside, and I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end, the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole eval, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it, that he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it, though. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later, and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job, and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because, well, it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Story 4. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them, and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantrums. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think, so I had to put them on restriction within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily, the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart the curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged it just in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. Story 5. Not a psychologist, but saw a breakdown in my ex that scared me senseless. He had just started meds, and the meds reacted horribly with him for whatever reason. He mostly had hallucinations, but sometimes he'd black out and do activities and not remember them. He would call me screaming at 3 a.m., and he didn't remember a second of it, any of it. He had hallucinations before, but they got increasingly dangerous with these meds. In particular, I think of one instance. While on the phone during an episode, he said, "I boiled some water." I asked why, as it was 3 a.m., and he replied eerily, calmly, "They told me I have to stick my hand in here." It was absolutely terrifying. I finally begged him to go to the hospital the following morning to ask for a medication change, and he begrudgingly obliged. While he was there, he started throwing up blood and had to get his stomach pumped. Turns out, in one of his blackouts, he swallowed his entire bottle of medication. Story 6. I had a client years ago who had recently got out of prison for assaulting a police officer pretty badly. The client had a volatile temper and lived in a violent family growing up. The client never got angry with me. However, while talking about their family and other people in their life, the client would get just so worked up with anger that I sometimes wondered if I was safe. I started pretending to be on emergency call duty in the clinic where I work so that I had an excuse to carry a walkie-talkie with me during our sessions. Shortly after I began doing that, I terminated the therapeutic relationship and referred the client for a completely different type of treatment than what I provided. The last I heard, the new treatment method was helping the client. Story 7. Clinical psychologist in training here. I've never been afraid, but my friend had a client once who made her extremely uncomfortable. Without revealing any information that could break confidentiality, I will say that he had issues with masturbating too much and not doing much else, and at one point asked my friend if they could watch porn together in the next session so he could show her what he does. At another time, he talked about his masturbation habits while touching his dick through his pants a bit. Totally inappropriate behavior, obviously. This client had lots of other issues, but when these things came up, her supervisor took her off the case because it just wasn't suitable for training and my friend didn't feel safe. Story 8. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in 1S, which is the ward for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean like he was 6'5" with gigantic muscles and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go head-to-head with. We would sometimes have to call the police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him, and go, "Nope," and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to 1S. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room, and then walks out naked. The dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away, and looks down at me. I mean like way down, as I'm only 5'3". He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no, he's leaving, and I better step aside. So of course I did. You better believe I stepped the hell aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the grounds, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police as to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into his secure room. However, once he's in there, they're not allowed to restrain him past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we get into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later, I'm no longer security or live in the town, but I went for a metal show. I joked to friends that I was worried someone I had dealt with in the hospital might recognize me and have had bad memories. Lo and behold, there's an MMA fighter taking shots at the bar. Now, I know that he shouldn't be drinking with his meds, but hey, it's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. I still tried to avoid him in case he remembered my shape-shifting. At one point, our lines to the bar coincided and I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me, looked down, and then looked back up and stared. Hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night, I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a pretty bit scared, yeah. Story 9. My brother-in-law is low-functioning, autistic, and blind. At one point, his care provider, who had worked with him for years and knew him quite well, got into a very dangerous situation with him. She had worked with him since he was smaller and had become experienced at interacting safely when he would become angry and aggressive. They had found a good balance of medication for him and she let her guard down. This time, though, he was now 20 years old and 6 feet tall. In a split second, he attacked her, jumping up from the couch directly across from her chair. He was very strong and viciously aggressive. I found myself in tough situations with him, and I'm 6'4", 225 pounds. After receiving quite a few blows from his hands, hair was torn out and bites on her arms and hands, she was able to push away across the ground and get behind the couch he had been sitting on. She quickly slid the couch into a corner so that he wouldn't have a way around it easily, and she hid behind it and tried to be very quiet. He searched that corner of the room for over an hour, following the front and side edges of the couch with his hands, back and forth pacing, until he eventually lost interest and went to play with some toys in the corner of the room. She got out of the corner and ran for her door just as her assistant was coming to remind her that she had gone over the allotted time. Now, my brother-in-law, he's an amazing guy, and I've had some awesome experiences with him over the years, but the idea of being hunted sounds like that is pretty freaky. Story 10. Good friend of my wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously screwed up people for a living. Let's just say Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she's assigned to a case, and this includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing stuff. She's tough as nails, and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case once because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently, this guy was either a serial rapist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile and she fits it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims, well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night, despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it as a hunter-slash-prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter-of-fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Story 11. I'm not a psychologist, but I have 2 psych degrees and I've been in and out of psychiatric wards since my late teens. For 14 years, I worked with adults with developmental disabilities. So, as you can imagine, I've seen my fair share of frightening behavior. But nothing scared me more than nannying for a 5-year-old boy with autism and a mood disorder. He had just been released from the hospital where he had stayed for a month to get acclimated to behavioral meds. But in the short 2 weeks I nannied for him, I feared for my life. He would kick and bite and scratch, hit, spit, come after me with knives, punch cars, scream loud enough for neighbors to think he was being abused, and destroyed his mother's picture-perfect apartment. And when I tried to tell his mom that he needed more help than a babysitter could give him, she fired me, saying I was wrong and that he just needs someone more attentive. Complete denial. Story 12. When I was studying psychology in my final year, I had the opportunity to meet with convicted felons. Essentially, I sat down and spoke to a man in his 30-ish, maybe-ish years, who was a sexual offender. He told me he used to marry women and then rape their young daughters. Each was in the range of 6 to 7 years old. I listened to him explain it, and it was literally my instructions not to judge them. I had to sign a waiver to not get emotional. So I asked him about the home life of those he abused. He says that some of the women he married had other children, and in one case there was an older sister who was 13, but he would never ever touch her. He dropped her off at school, where he told me he was never into any of the children he saw, and take her to practice and friends' houses, and while she was gone, he'd go back and rape her 6-year-old sister. He told me that it really isn't about being attracted to prepubescent girls. It's about the dominance and the power that comes with having sex with them. He's being rehabilitated now, though. The weird part was that I wasn't sure if he was acting remorseful, because if he was, he's amazing at it. He's just very open to my questions and expressed regret, and I almost believed him. However, when I met a man who was convicted of child porn, his "I feel terribles" were transparent and so full of crap it was disgusting. My professors warned me about manipulation, so that was easy to catch on to, but with the previous guy, he was either an impeccable liar and manipulator, or he genuinely wanted to get better. Crazy. Story 13. Oh man, once I was psychotic, bipolar, in a hospital, and I imagined my parents and little brother were there. And I imagined again that they came up an escalator into the hospital, not real, and my dad was about to be beaten up by these guys. In real life, I attacked the nurse trying to get to them, pushed her over, tried to pull out my catheter, and ran around looking to save my dad with nurses trying to hold me down. I feel absolutely horrid looking back because I really hurt that nurse, and by the time I came to and wanted to apologize, her shift had long ended and I never saw her again to say sorry. Story 14. I'm a farm worker, and the grandson of the guy I worked for was off the charts crazy. The grandparents couldn't control him. They bought him a .22 rifle. It had a trigger lock. They gave him the key and some ammunition. I locked it away because he was 6 years old. He threatened to shoot me, so I put him in timeout. He craps on the floor and laughs like a crazy animal. I came to find out it was his sister's rifle I took away because a few hours later, he came outside with his rifle, trigger lock off the bolt, and ammunition in his pocket to kill me for taking away his sister's gun. Every day I had to deal with something like this. I have seen other workers chasing this 6-year-old kid with hammers. It's crazy. I have many stories about that year. I warned him to stop playing on the roof of a tractor. He would get hurt, and I'm not there to watch that crap. He starts to get down and just seemed to flop down on purpose, landing stomach first on the back of the tractor. It would have hurt so bad, and he cried for about 20 seconds. Then he cackled with laughter, and he probably broke ribs, and I saw massive bruises on his stomach when he lifted his shirt to check for cuts. I watched him kill baby chickens by first saying how cute and petting them they are, then standing on them. He tortured the farm dog to the point it growled when he went near, and at one point, I actually had to stop the dog from killing him. They had him by the back of the neck and was chomping down, and he was crying, then burst into laughter. I can't speak enough about this kid to convey the frustration he would cause. He scared me, and I was on a farm where aggressive black Angus bulls were a daily thing. Everyone hated that kid. I'm relieved I'm not around him anymore. He's coming your way, psychologists. Story 15. A therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going about it for 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague, but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive, but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week, and this guy's back again. He's noticeably agitated this time and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag, and he breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past. But she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excuses herself and calls the police. The guy was very compliant and he'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying and says the moral of the story is to treat all of your clients well because you never know who's plotting your murder. Story 16. Master's level psychotherapist here. was doing anger management with a young person about 19, 20 years old, on probation for domestic assault. When we were talking about the situation and what happened, he said, "My girlfriend had a smart mouth, so I punched her in it, her mouth." I was talking to his probation agent later about his cold demeanor, and he told me to watch him closely, suggested verbatim that he could be the next Ted Bundy. This was a police officer that usually didn't get involved with the treatment program unless probationers were really high risk, and his words had spooked me. The kid violated probation quickly and was sentenced to a few more years, which we all thought was fine. He was creepy. Story 17. Not a psych, but I worked with parolees for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court, and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with him. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because, quote, they understood him. At this point, I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole and did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females, quote, had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Toward the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I am all for the rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there.